George Pickens being on the Cowboys now reminds me a lot of this former receiver they used to have that I was a huge fan of when I first got into the NFL as a youngin'. He used to wear number 88. He threw up the X when he scored touchdowns. The Cowboys have their new Dez Bryant and George Pickens. George Pickens has a lot of similarities in his game to Dez Bryant. Dez Bryant, he was highly emotional. He had moments when he tended to crash out, when he wasn't getting the ball. He wasn't the easiest guy to appease. He was a physically imposing receiver. Anytime you threw the ball Dez Bryant's way when he was at his peak, he was coming down with it. There wasn't no such thing as a 50-50 ball Dez Bryant. It pretty much was 80-20 when you threw it his way because he routinely won those 50-50 matchups. And the same thing with George Pickens. When you threw him the ball in Pittsburgh, he was always coming down with that thing. And this is a guy who had 1,100 yards in 2023 with Mitchell Trubisky, Kenny Pickett, and Mason Rudolph throwing him the football. So if he can have that level of success in Pittsburgh, imagine how good he's going to be in Dallas with Dak Prescott throwing him the football, which is the best quarterback that he's been with up to this point in his career. Dez Bryant also was one of those receivers that you never, ever were going to leave him and one-on-one coverage with no safety help over the top because that just was a suicide mission. With George Pickens, it's the same way. He's so good at making those contested catches to where you got no choice but to play too high now when you go up against Dallas. Because are you going to double team CeeDee Lamb and leave George Pickens in one-on-one coverage? Or are you going to double cover George Pickens and leave CeeDee Lamb in one-on-one coverage? You're not going to do either one. So the only way you can limit the amount of big plays that Dallas can generate this year is by playing a lot of too high coverage, which is going to open up that ground game for Dallas because when you play too high, you don't have as many bodies to help against the run. And that's a similar impact that Dez Bryant had when he was playing for Dallas. Although he was the undisputed number one, George Pickens isn't the undisputed number one right now. The Cowboys had Jason Witten. They had Terrence Williams, who was also really underrated. So having a guy like George Pickens just causes a lot of headaches for opposing defensive coordinators. Because even if you don't feel like George Pickens is as good as what a prime Dez Bryant was, you still have to game plan for him in a similar way that you did with Dez Bryant. And now with you having a big play target, it's going to help your red zone offense improve, which was an area of this Cowboys offense that hindered them in 2024. George Pickens has so many similarities or commonalities in his game with Dez Bryant that it's insane. And, you know, neither one of these guys were crazy good route runners. George Pickens, he's not the most polished route runner. He's not somebody that's going to do a lot of damage underneath. Same thing with Dez Bryant. Neither one of those guys were good after the catch. Dez Bryant wasn't really somebody that you knew as being a burner after the catch. Same thing with George Pickens. But these, or at least when you compare their skill set, that's how I view this trade for the Dallas Cowboys. They were trying to find their new Dez Bryant, and they got that. And it's scary how closely George Pickens resembles Dez Bryant from just his mannerisms, his behavior, his character, and his skill set on the field. And when Dez Bryant was at his best, you know, at one point, we were somewhat having debates about if he was better or just as good as Calvin Johnson. Now, obviously, Calvin Johnson was the better of the two. Dez Bryant felt like he was better than Calvin Johnson. But, you know, for a while, 2-3 year stretch, the gap wasn't as wide as what you might have thought. Dez Bryant, a lot of folks forget how truly good he was. And I'm a little bit biased. The nostalgia may be getting the best of me in this conversation just because I always was a huge fan of Dez Bryant. And if he never would have had the amount of injuries that he did after signing that contract extension, he would have gone on to have a Hall of Fame career. That's how good he was. And George Pickens could be on that same trajectory. If you can have the amount of production that George Pickens had with a bunch of randos throwing him the football at quarterback, Dak Prescott, say what you want, he's really good in the regular season. He'll get you the ball. He's one of the better deep ball throwers in the league. And with Brian Schottenheimer being the head coach now, him calling the plays, remember when he was the offensive coordinator a while back with, I believe it was the New York Jets, they made a lot of deep playoff runs, not being the most flashiest offense. They just ran the football a lot, and they started killing you with play action over the top. That's how good this Cowboys offense is going to be this year with the addition of George Pickens down the big D alongside of CeeDee Lamb. And Dez Bryant, his career probably could have been a little bit prolonged if the Cowboys were able to pair him up with another capable number one wide receiver. But now with George Pickens feeding off CeeDee Lamb, that's going to help him have even more success. When the Steelers had Deontay Johnson, who is nowhere on the level as what CeeDee Lamb was, but when you had a receiver that had the ability to work underneath and do that dirty work while you let George Pickens eat over the top, that's when George Pickens was at his best. He's a low-end wide receiver 1, but he's probably the best wide receiver 2 in the league when you complement him with the high-end elite wide receiver 1 alongside of him, which is what the Dallas Cowboys have done by making this trade. And now you have him and CeeDee Lamb, which is a top 3 receiver duo in the league right now. We talk about Jamar Chase and T. Higgins and A.J. Brown, Devontae Smith. This Pickens and CeeDee Lamb duo is up there with them as well. But when I just watch George Pickens play, I just see a lot of similarities in his game to Dez Bryant. He's a lot slimmer than what Dez Bryant was, but he still is a really physically imposing receiver. He wins off physicality. He's not really a finesse guy. And they just have so many commonalities with how they play the receiver position. And that's why I feel the Dallas Cowboys have their Dez Bryant 2.0 now and George Pickens.